and a desire to, as I said, get our borrowing back to a responsible level and debt to be falling again in a couple of years' time. Now, in terms of the individual measures and whether they're fair and progressive, I am very confident that they are. If you look at the two measures that were announced and legislated for in 2021 spring budget, which are the two measures that largely solve the problem of coronavirus on our public finances, one was a rise in the corporation tax rate. So large companies that are profitable will pay more in corporation tax. 70% of companies will be exempted from that change. Their corporation tax rate will stay the same, but the largest, most successful companies will pay more, but still at a rate that is internationally very competitive, lowest in the G7, fourth or fifth lowest in the G20.
I'm keen to stick to how progressive these are.
That was one measure. The other measure in that budget was freezing the income tax personal allowances, which was widely recommended by a range of different people as being a progressive way to raise money. Just by nature of the income tax system, which is progressive, obviously freezing thresholds raises more money from those on higher incomes. It also does so in a way that supports the recovery because it builds over time. And of course, people are not cash losers from that because it's about a threshold increase rather than taking cash out of people's pockets. So those two measures, I think, are progressive. They were described as such. And as I said, large profitable businesses and a progressive way to raise money over time. Now that's that. Now then, in terms of the health and social care levy, there are three ways you could have raised that amount of money sustainably, in my view. One's VAT, one's national insurance, and one's income tax. There are, I think of those three, the VAT is the least progressive, so the choice is left between income tax and national insurance, and people will have their view as to which one of those would have been the better base for the levy. I think we've already had that debate here and we went through it, and there are reasons why income tax is progressive, potentially more progressive than national insurance, but there are other downsides of income tax as well, which we discussed last time, not least that it's not a UK-wide tax in the same way anymore. Businesses don't contribute to it directly in the same way, and there's no history in this country of operational or other hypothecation of that tax to the health service the way there is with national insurance. Anyway, but I think no one can say that national insurance is not a progressive way to raise that money. Top 15% of NICS payers will contribute over half the revenues from that levy. It was described by IFS, Andrew Dilnott, many others, as a progressive way to raise the money. So I think the way we've raised the money has been very progressive. And in terms of the tax cuts, if you look at what we announced last week, a raise to the national insurance personal threshold to £12,500, £12,570, was again described when it was announced in the campaign as the best way to help low and middle earners through the tax system. So that's what the Institute of Fiscal Studies said, and that's because obviously it is a flat rate, £360, disproportionately benefits those on low and middle incomes. So I do believe that was the most progressive way to reward work through the tax system and cut taxes on working people. And I'm not, so do I think the tax cuts we're doing are progressive? Yes, I do. We started there. Oh, actually, we started back in October by cutting the taper rate in universal credit very significantly from 63% to 55%. That's a £2 billion tax cut, improvement in the generosity of universal credit. That disproportionately benefits those on the absolute lowest incomes in a universal credit.
You think universal credit is generous?
Hold on, can I?
So I'm sure we'll come to other
to
members, but so Chair, in terms of those are the two personal tax cuts that we've announced in October and just now. I do believe they're progressive, and that's the reason.
All right, Dan.
I was just going to say, and obviously we published our normal distributional analysis, which shows that the decisions taken since 2019 will by 2014, where we'll be at the end of the Parliament, which shows that the impact of tax is progressive as a percentage of net income by decile. So,
okay. For what it's worth, personally, I would probably accept most of that. But if we pick up on your point about the taper rate, so the taper rate, you're right. If you're in work and on UC, that's quite a valuable boost to your income. But if you're not in work and you're on UC or other benefits, what was it in the statement that you've just delivered that, if I'm in that situation, gives me any cause for hope when it comes to the cost of living crisis?
I think, first of all, for those on UC, it's important to remember that I think close to 2/3 either are or can work. Right, so the vast majority of people on UC are in that category. So they will benefit not just from the taper rate, but from the increase in the national living wage and the considerable support on the spending side that we are providing to help people get the skills they need to find their first job or a new job that pays them more. So there's an enormous amount of spending going on, a 26% real increase over this Parliament in skills spending, 3.8 billion pounds annually, and that is going to all help those people as well. So that's the vast majority of people will benefit from all those interventions. And then for those that can't, there are a range of different things. The Household Support Fund, which we announced an extra £500 million for. To
very small in the context of the total amounts involved here.
It's targeted support to those who need it most. That comes on top of the significant energy support package that was announced in February to take effect just in a couple of weeks.
Can I stop just for 1 second, Chancellor? Can I just stop for 1 second? So when we had the OBR in just now, we asked them about how much it would cost, for example, to uprate benefits by the rate of inflation rather than pegging it to the number back in September.
Yeah, it would be about, over the scorecard period, it would be about £25 billion.
Yeah, so they gave a figure of 11 billion, which I guess is probably in the...
Yeah, so over the scorecard period, it would be £25 billion.
Yeah, so your 500 million, although it is, you're right, targeted, and it's useful in that sense, and part of the art here is to keep trying to target, and I know it's got rough edges and it's difficult, and I totally accept that. It is quite a relatively very small amount, isn't it, compared to the amount of money that it would cost to actually increase those benefits in line with, what inflation is actually doing.
If we just go through some of the other things, though, so there's obviously...
But on that point, though, before...
Yeah, but I think, there's also the increase to the local housing allowance that was put in place during the crisis and kept, which is worth about £600 to 1.5 million people, which is an extra billion or so pounds. That this year there's £670 million to help about 3 million people with their council tax payments already in place, and the energy package is disproportionately beneficial to those on the lowest incomes or not in work as a percentage of their household
So there are various
budgets.
things going on, but we can't really get away from the fact that if you're out of work and in benefits, there was very little really in the spring statement, particularly when you take into account the number that you've just shared with us and what the OBR told us earlier about the cost of that uprating overall, and in the context of the £500 million that's been set aside for the household hardship fund or whatever it's called.
Which is what we've done previously as well, and it's support that is well targeted to local authorities, knowing who the most vulnerable families are in their areas. But as a general point about if someone's view is that government can or should make everybody whole for inflation, particularly inflation at these levels caused by global supply factors, then that's something that I don't think is
and
doable.
nobody's saying that.
But just to give, but that, I think
you can't make up for the whole of this external
but that is the.
But it's about where you put the support and what it amounts to. And I'm just pointing out, I think that there is this particular group who are probably struggling quite a lot and who have had, it appears, less support than perhaps other areas. Now there may be good reasons for that, but I think that's something we can't quite entirely step away from.
And then these are all choices. So and the choices that we have made are to cut fuel duty, because given the cost of petrol and the vast majority of people reliant on their cars, that's a very significant £2.5 billion tax cut that's come in and will benefit the vast majority of people, everyone who is using their car. To cut the tax on working people by £6 billion, £330 a person for 30 million people in work. I think it's the right thing to do, particularly because some of the other things we've had to do have increased the tax burden, as we've previously discussed, so it's right that there is a priority there to start now cutting taxes for those people. And so I do think those are the right things to do, and there's targeted support that we've provided to those that you've described, but also an enormous amount to help people move from welfare into work, both on the spending and on the tax side, which ultimately is the most sustainable route out of poverty.
On the uprating to benefits and this point about it being pegged to September, 3.1%, inflation is heading, as we know, towards 8%, could be 9%, even more. Did you consider any measures along the lines of trying to smooth that pain across from the September reference point to the next September reference point? Were there any approaches that you potentially had in mind there? And I'm curious as to why you might not have explored that or done something around that particular issue.
Well, there's an operational question, which Dan can speak to in a second, where there is actually just a 4 to 5 month actual operational lag between a policy decision and the system being able to implement it because of how the DWP systems work, so that it is actually not possible to do it in a short space of time, actually, in the first instance. And one of the systems, I think, can only do it once a year in any case. And secondly, it kind of goes back to the broader point that we were discussing earlier, and that's about borrowing, right? And what is a responsible amount of borrowing at a time when we are worried about the macroeconomic outlook, particularly with regard to interest rates and inflation. And we are already now forecast to borrow in this forthcoming year about 60% more as a percentage of GDP than our post-war average, almost 20% more as a percentage of GDP than we were forecast to borrow in October. So it's already a significant amount of borrowing. And my job is to make the right long-term decisions. And my view is that an excessive amount of borrowing now is not the responsible thing to do. It's not the responsible thing to do both for the short term, because it may risk actually stoking inflation even further, which is going to harm all the people that we're trying to help if we actually make the situation worse. And over time, having an irresponsible approach to borrowing and debt continuing to go up is not the right long-term thing
nobody would advocate an irresponsible
for the country
approach to borrowing, and you've anchored your answer on borrowing. But taxation is the other balancing act here. You chose to lower taxes. You chose to make the move on income tax.
You're talking about two different things. You're talking about 2022.
But
you're right that there's a choice.
You could have put more relief into that out of work benefits.
You're absolutely right.
So in this taxation,
in this
not
forthcoming year,
borrowing.
Absolutely right. In this forthcoming year, we made a choice to cut taxes on working people. 30 million people in work will benefit from the increase in personal tax thresholds, disproportionately those on lower middle incomes. You're absolutely right. Someone else sitting here could have said, I'd rather spend that £6 billion on the welfare system. That's absolutely a choice that someone else could have made, yes.
And why did you make it the way you made it rather than
because I think the other policies we've got to help people on welfare are the right approach to do that. They're more targeted, they help people move from welfare into work, and we're spending a lot and cutting the tax on the UC side to do that. So I think the mix of policies we've got is the right mix, and also, as Dan pointed out, the distribution analysis that has been published is very clear that taken together, the actions of this government over this Parliament are highly progressive.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Angela.
Thank you very much. Afternoon, Chancellor.
Afternoon, Angela.
Hi. We're contemplating now the biggest fall in living standards since records began, according to the OBR analysis. And your spring statement has offset 1% of that, but this OBR are still forecasting a 2.2% fall in living standards over the next financial year. But that goes up to 6% for the poorest. Why haven't you done more to help those who are really going to struggle massively with this cost of living situation?
Well, I think, Angela, it's probably the same answer that we were just discussing with the chair, so there's probably not much more I can add to it. On terms of the living standards analysis, yeah, that's right. Just so we're clear, the forecast drop on the way that they calculate it was about 3%, and the measures that we have put in place, significant measures worth about £20 billion, offset about a third. So the considerable action that we've put in place is offsetting about a third of the drop in living standards, which is a significant contribution.
That's average. And the point I was making was actually that the poorest are hit harder.
So if I just get onto that. So, and actually the biggest contributor to that number is what happens. Well, first of all, it is all entirely driven by prices. Right, so the entire drop in living standards is a function of the price levels, which, as everybody knows, are global in nature. If you look at where inflation was here and the most recent numbers, very similar to the Eurozone and lower than the US. So these are global forces that are causing this drop in living standards on prices. The combination actually of labour income and taxation is a net positive to living standards. And the energy price cap, as I said, is the biggest determinant of what this number will actually be. And the reality is, none of us know what the price cap is going to be in the autumn. And there's an estimate in the OBR based on whatever.
It will go up by 40%. That's the current estimate.
That was an estimate that is already out of date.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think on the last numbers I saw last week, it was already about 10% lower than that from memory. It is incredibly volatile. And I think the forecast for the energy price cap has been in the last few weeks for October has been something like £3,500. The lowest has been just over £2,000, which is not actually a million miles away from where it was forecast to be in February when we made the announcement about what we would do to help with energy prices this year. So that just shows you the scale of volatility there. And that's why, as we said very clearly in the spring statement document, we will continue to monitor the situation, and as we know more, are prepared to act if necessary. Now, we've had this conversation now about what you're doing to help certain people. Clearly, it is very difficult to sit here today and speculate on what happens to energy prices, therefore the biggest impact on living standards in the autumn. Let's wait until we get there and then can decide on the most appropriate course of action. But I don't think anyone today knows what that appropriate course of action ought to be.
Yeah, I mean, to sum up then, you've made a political choice to plunge 1.3 million people, including 500,000 children, into absolute poverty. On the figures we have now, that is what you've chosen to do in your spring statement.
No, what I've chosen to do is ameliorate, on average, a third of the impact on living standards from forces that are clearly outside of my control, global in nature. We've come up with a package that is progressive in the way it's been designed, and crucially will not add to the inflationary pressures in a significant way, which would harm the very people that we care about and want to make sure that we do care for, and have put in place specific support to help them. Now, I totally accept you might have preferred to say, well, I would rather not cut taxes on 30 million working people.
Don't put words into my mouth.
No, but you said it's choice, right? So there's, and as the chair said, so
I'm asking about
there's a
your
choice that people can make within a constraint of how much
about
is a responsible amount to borrow.
What I'm trying to do,
I'm comfortable with the
Chancellor,
choices that I've made are the
Chancellor,
right ones for the country.
What I'm trying to do is tease out your choices. I don't want you to speculate on what mine might have been. The issue here is that we've got people on fixed rates of income that are going to suffer very, very badly in the next period, whatever happens in October. For example, a single person caring for their parent whose main source of income is their carer's allowance of £67 a week. They're not going to be able to accommodate a huge trebled, quadrupled energy bill, are they? You've not helped them.
Well, we've announced £9 billion worth of support in February to help people with energy bills.
Social security benefits.
Well, could I just answer the question?
By 12 billion in real terms, a minus 5% real terms cut in welfare and social security benefits doesn't seem the best way of approaching this vicious increase in the cost of living for those people on the lowest levels of income, fixed income.
So, again, we've just announced £9 billion worth of support to help people with energy bills. That is worth about half of the increase in the price cap in April. It will disproportionately benefit those on lowest incomes with smaller energy bills, and it's been clear that that's what it will do. We also thought very hard about those people with prepayment meters to make sure that the support we've designed will equally benefit them, and have been careful about that, and the Department for Business are working through the implementation of that. I'm very mindful of the impact on people in difficult circumstances or on low incomes, which is why I'm pleased that our policies are helping them. So if you take a single mother, for example, who's working full-time on the national living wage with in rented accommodation, that mum is going to be £1,600 better off, £1,600 better off as a result of the changes we have made on taxes and national living wage over the last few months and what we've announced last week. So that's putting significant money into the pockets of someone like that, who of course I know needs our support. But to your broader point, there are choices, and what I'm trying to balance between is what is a responsible amount of borrowing at a time when there's enormous uncertainty in the outlook. The risks are skewed to the upside, or the downside rather, but upside on inflation and interest rates. And within that constraint, how best to target the support. Now, you may say you would be happy, not you, or one may say if they don't like my choices, they would be happy to borrow a lot more. That's just not something that I think is responsible or sensible. I think it has the risk of stoking inflationary pressure, and I don't think it's the right long-term thing to do for the country. I think we need to be responsible with borrowing. I think we need to be getting debt down and borrowing under control. So that provides for me a constraint as to what is possible, and then there's a choice about where to target that support. And I appreciate people may have wanted to do more on welfare, less to cut taxes to people in work. Other people may have chosen to borrow lots more. Those are not the choices that I would be comfortable with.
You've increased taxes for people in work. 7 out of 8 of those people who are in work are having a higher tax burden this year, and the tax burden is higher at the end of what you've done. Than it was.
Actually, sorry, hang on. No, we should just do that. So, because of the increase in the NIC's personal threshold, 70% of NIC's payers will pay less tax than they would otherwise, and that is a result of the measures that we have. That is the result of the. Well, no, hang on. No.
It's the net figure that matters.
But that's
we take it all into account, and the thresholds. Sorry.
That is exactly right. It is the net impact. So yes, the levy is coming in, but there's a very significant increase in the personal tax in the national insurance personal threshold. I'm talking about your entire period
as Chancellor. You've increased.
But you were talking about this
times.
year. You were talking about this year, which is obviously where the most of the challenge is with inflation over the next 12 months. 70% of NIC's payers will be better off as a result of the way we've done the personal threshold increase, because it particularly targets those on lower middle incomes.
As a result of you freezing in cash terms income tax allowances, everybody will be worse off. So you're being very partial in the way in which you're explaining this. You're only talking about this year's tax, the threshold increases. You're not talking about the fact that you've frozen income tax thresholds in cash terms. So levels of income tax and the burden of paying income tax for those who pay it goes up. You can't only talk about, Chancellor, one side of this equation and expect everybody to be fooled by the distorted view that gives of the tax burden. The fact is the tax burden is going up. It's going up. It was going up before the spring statement, and it's going up after the spring statement, is it not?
So I completely accept that, and we had that discussion with the chair, and I actually went over in detail the measures we had put in place to raise taxes to fix the damage done by coronavirus, and I talked very specifically about corporation tax and the freezing of income tax, personal tax thresholds. I was pretty transparent and open about that today, as I was at the time that we did it. So I'm not remotely saying that that's not happening.
Well,
I'm also confirmed that is a progressive thing to do. And the conversation that we started this session with talked about actually the space we have against our fiscal rules is relatively modest given the outlook. So yes, is the tax burden forecast to rise? As we discussed previously, it is forecast to rise because we are continuing to invest strongly in public services whilst to the tune of 3.7% real terms growth at the same time as recovering from a once in 350-year economic shock. And to focus on one without the other, I don't think is reasonable.
You style yourself as a tax-cutting Chancellor, but you're not, are you?
I've not actually said that. What I've said very clearly is I'm a Chancellor that's had to deal with a pandemic. And I've dealt with the pandemic. And then, given the damage that the pandemic has done, with a desire to continue investing in more nurses, greater social care investment, more police on the street, levelling up, the choice we had was to either cut public spending significantly or to continue to deliver on our plans to improve people's quality of life through all of those things, but make sure that it's paid for as we continue to get our borrowing under control to a level that I believe is responsible. And that's why the tax burden is going up. So I'm sure if I'd taken a different decision and we'd said, well, we'll just slash public spending to get there, you'd probably be the first person to say, hang on, all this austerity is back, right? So the two things go together. The taxes are paying for very significant increases in public spending. The reason the burdens had to rise is because we've been hit by a once-in-a-century pandemic, a once-in-a-350-year economic shock, highest borrowing since World War II. I don't think it's reasonable to divorce those two things. They're intricately linked. And then I've been very clear, though, from the autumn, from this point on, now that repair work has been done, the priority going forward is to reduce taxes. Now, let's see where we get to over time, but the priority with the marginal pounds from this point is to reduce taxes, but yes, after having taken some decisions to correct the damage that was done. That's the story of it, as plain and simple as that. I don't think anyone's trying to overclaim anything beyond that.
Chancellor, the National Audit Office has said that between 12.4 billion to 20 billion pounds has been wasted in the emergency coronavirus schemes. The Treasury has no knowledge of or little in the way of the consequences of fraud to our economy and society. That's a fair comment, isn't it?
No, I don't believe it's. I don't believe it's fair. So again, it's important to remember the context, and whether it was on furlough or whether it was on something like the bounce back loan schemes, the absolute priority was to try and get support to people who needed it, often people on very low incomes, who we've been discussing rightly, as quickly as possible in the midst of a crisis. Now, in my job, I have to make certain trade-offs in that, and I can put all the fraud checks I want at the beginning of a process, and that would have meant that it would have taken weeks and weeks and weeks, for example, to get money out to the over 1 million small businesses that ultimately did get it, when at the time, and I remember being in Parliament on an almost daily basis at the time, being asked rightly by colleagues, we need money in hours, let alone days and weeks, it's hours, or we're going to have to lay off everyone. And that's the trade-offs that we were making. Now, so we designed things in the way that we did. Now, of course, we take fraud really seriously. We haven't written anything off. We are going after anyone who may well have defrauded the taxpayer in both the HMRC schemes and the loan schemes. We invest, and we started taking action on this over a year ago by investing extra money, £100 million into HMRC to hire an extra 1,200 people to do this, the Taxpayer Protection Task Force. Therefore, they've already recovered £500 million and a forecast to recover at least another billion or so plus. We will update on how all that work is going in the coming months, but my sense of is we are doing a good job in getting the fraud estimates actually down to a level which will end up being, I think, in the context of what we're dealing with, acceptable. And on the bounce back loan side, because of the measures we've put in place, we've blocked £2 billion worth of loans. There's dozens of arrests that have been made. We've taken new powers to strike people off, the directors list, and again, we're creating new data and fraud analytics to go after people. And there was more money announced for all of that last week. But Dan,
Lord Agnew pointed out in his evidence to us on this issue that between 1,000 and 1,500 companies lent bounce back loans didn't exist previously to the pandemic, and that wasn't even checked before they were given any loans. He estimated that 4 billion lost. If the average loan was £40,000, there would have been 100,000 occurrences of fraud, and you've made 49 arrests. The fact is that if you did more about fraud, there'd be more money to spend on helping your priorities or my priorities, whoever priorities were available. This is an anemic, complacent response to the expenditure of public money, isn't it?
No, I completely reject that. And actually, I think we've paid out on fraud claims on bounce back loans 20-30 million pounds so far, because we are aggressively making sure that we don't pay out unnecessarily.
Why did Lord Agnew, your own minister, resign in frustration at it?
That's a question for him. What I know is that
the
estimate of fraud losses from bounce back loans actually has gone down by a third. Right, it was meant to be around 4.9 billion from memory. It's been cut by 1.6 billion pounds. So it's already been cut by a third, the fraud estimates, after the accounts that Bayes had last year were published, because we are making very good progress. And actually, at the time, people were expecting something like 60% of the value of these bounce back loans to be lost. And everyone knew that at the time we did them. As it turns out, that because of the other things we've done to grow the economy, 80% of that loan portfolio is currently performing well, which in the context of how it was done, I think is a very positive result for the taxpayer. Far more was expected to have to be written off, actually. So I don't know, Dan, is there anything to add? But you had the quote from the EFA, right?
Yeah, I mean, the only things that I would add are in their economic and fiscal outlook, the OBR have reduced by not quite half the estimate of loan guarantee fraud compared to the Bayes annual report and accounts. They also say that the sum should be considered against the potential economic costs of acting more slowly, and they think that it's not unreasonable to think that the economic costs of taking more time in designing the schemes, and therefore money not getting to people could have been far greater. And indeed, one of the reasons that there's been a reduction in their estimate of the cost of pandemic support is because of their revision downwards of the loan guarantees being called, but also fraud in loan guarantees. So there has been an improvement since their last forecast in these estimates.
Lord Agnew also told us he thought there was a complete disjunction between the level of criminality and the enforcement capacity. So why have you cut the National Crime Agency's budget by 4.5%?
I don't believe that it has been cut. We've invested, I think, 63 million pounds more, I think, in economic crime from memory at the last spending review. We're also raising a £100 million economic crime levy for the first time that's been legislated for, that will raise money to go and combat economic crime. And last week we put extra money into creating a public sector fraud authority at the Cabinet Office, but also to give more money to, now I forget, it's either NATIS or the NCA, to do exactly even more enforcement action, because we're figuring out what's working most effectively, and we're giving it more resources so that they can do more of it.
And are you confident that the sanctions regimes that are being put into place at the moment following the Russian invasion of Ukraine are going to be enforced properly, when I think at the last count you had 37.8 full-time equivalent people running that regime in the Treasury?
So it's the sanctions regime is overseen by OFSI. It's obviously part of the Treasury, but a separate body. I think from memory they had about 45 to 49, one of the two, full-time equivalents previous to this, and they are on course and have been given the resources to double that number. And they're already hiring I think they've started hiring. I can't remember, is it 45 or 49, but it's one of the two. And they're doubling that number in the process of doing that.
Are you confident that they're hiring at the right level, though?
We've asked them what they need, and they've been given the resources to hire the people they need. So, and it is, as I said, it is doubling. I mean, I don't know how quickly they will get them all in. That we got to find out how. But they have started the process already of recruiting the doubling of people.
Thank you, Angela. Anthony.
Thank you, Chair, and hello, Chancellor. Before the spring statement, there are lots of calls from many places for you to delay or scrap the increase in national insurance, but you decided to raise the threshold instead. Why did you decide not to delay it or scrap it?
For a number of reasons. First of all, I think it's right that the country's number one priority, which is the NHS and social care alongside it, has a dedicated source of funding, so that we can be confident about its future and make sure that it has the funding it needs, not just today to deal with an unprecedented backlog, which I think everyone wants to see addressed, but also over time as the demographic pressures, particularly on the social care side, rise. And one of the lessons from the pandemic is we wanted to invest more in social care. So I think it's right that for the first time there is this dedicated funding stream. People can be reassured that every penny of this new levy will go to the thing that they care most about, and I think that is a good thing. We have a history of doing that through the NIC system, which we've already discussed, but it is also a very progressive way to fund the health service. As we've discussed, the top 15% of taxpayers account for over half the revenue raised. So, if you're looking for an answer to, and then so the second, so I think it's the right thing in and of its own terms. And secondly, if you were saying, well, how best do I help with the cost of living? Should I scrap that? As we've been discussing, given it is so progressive, the majority of the benefit of scrapping it would accrue to the top 15% of taxpayers, whereas what we've done by raising the thresholds, the national insurance thresholds, by such a considerable amount, is hugely beneficial for those on low and middle incomes, ensuring that 70% of taxpayers or NICS payers are actually better off with the combination of those things. So actually I think what we've done is much more progressive and will alleviate some of the strain that people are feeling on their household budgets at the moment, in a way that scrapping that levy wouldn't have done that, and I don't think for the long term would have been good, because we want to have a good source of funding for the thing we care most about.
When you raised the threshold, you made the point that you're raising exactly to the personal threshold for income tax, £12,570, and I think you quoted the Centre for Policy Studies, the universal working income. Why is it so important that those two thresholds are at the same level? Is that a new policy going forwards?
Well, it was a manifesto commitment that the government made and the Prime Minister announced in the election campaign, so it's nice to be able to fulfil it. And the reason it was there is it's because two things. One, it is a very progressive way to reward work, make sure that work pays, cutting taxes on working people, but doing so in a way that disproportionately benefits lower middle incomes. But also it represents a simplification of the tax system in a sense, because we had a situation where unearned income was, or earned income rather, was being taxed before unearned income because of the misalignment of those thresholds, and this is a simplification of the system. So now it's just easier for people to understand. For the first £12,570 that I earn, I won't pay a penny of national insurance or income tax.
You mentioned just now, but obviously that many times previously, that the increase in national insurance, the health and social care levy, is hypothecated for the NHS and social care. You've now reduced the threshold, which will mean less income. Does that mean there'll be less money for health and social care? And
no, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we've set those budgets, and they are the budgets. So the health and so the NHS and social care will receive the budgets that they were given at the spending review, and all the fluctuations up or down, and the levy revenue over the short term will be absorbed more generally. But then more specifically, actually, the vast majority of the levy revenue was raised above the £12,500 level, so it's just a few £100 million, so that's 600 million from memory, that was raised below, and that is essentially broadly offset by a slight increase in the forecast revenues from the levy in general. So in general there isn't a massive change, but even if there was, there is not a penny less going to the health and social care system.
So in what way is it actually hypothecated? If the budget's already set, then it doesn't...
Well, it's hypothecated, and then we set a budget based on that. But I don't think it would be right for the NHS and social care budgets to be cut in the middle of a period if, for whatever reason, the levy revenue came in lower. But over time, it is a hypothecated revenue stream. But I think for public policy and planning purposes, it's right that you'll have periods where it's set, and then they can be adjusted at the next spending review cycle.
You obviously you're trying to. The aim of the spring statement is to help people with the cost of living crisis, and if you've got a certain amount of money to do that with, you can either cut energy costs to reduce that, or increase household disposable income by cutting taxes or giving rebates on council tax or energy bills. Why have you decided to strike the balance where you are? Do you think it's better to help people have increase household incomes, disposable incomes, or to reduce energy bills? Because the risk of reducing energy bills, obviously, is that you encourage people to burn more energy.
Yes, I think there's different ways to do it. I think it's right that we have a targeted response to the.
Prevent hypothermia.
There's one specific factor which is causing the bulk of the increase in people's costs, and that is energy bills. So I think it's probably reasonable that there's a very clear policy response to that. Arguably, you could do it in different ways. I think having a direct response to that is sensible, and we've set out our way to do that. £9 billion, which will help lots of people with about £350, about half the increase. And then more generally, to help with pressures, we've, as I said, cut fuel duty and made sure that we cut the tax on working people. But
is there a risk if you cut energy costs, I'm thinking about the VAT on fuel as well, that actually you demand would be higher than it otherwise would be, and that will lead to energy prices being a bit higher?
We have some analysis on that. On the fuel duty side, I think they broadly washed because of the increase in wholesale fuel prices. So I don't think there was going to be a significant increase there. And on energy bills, in the short term, there's a degree to which people don't have an enormous amount of flexibility, right? There's obviously some flexibility and people can adjust their consumption a bit, but the big savings come from installing things like energy efficiency measures in your home, which can save quite considerable amounts over time, £300 a year. But in the short term, it's felt that there's not a huge amount you can do about your immediate energy bill within, other than making some short-term adjustments in how much you need, and obviously weather, which is outside of all of our control.
Okay, that's all my questions.
Thanks, Anthony. Alison, please.
Thank you, Chair. And moving on to energy bills, Chancellor. For many people up and down the country, there is no option really to put solar panels on their houses. They can barely afford to heat their homes and keep the lights on as it is. So could you tell me exactly how your Heat Now, Pay Later scheme will work for people on prepayment meters?
So let me take both things actually, Alison. So for prepayment meters, about 60% of them from memory we can do through direct debit, and it works automatically, so they'll get the benefit automatically. And for the remainder, there's a range of different things that we can do. One is by providing what's called, I think, a smart access code, which is provided to a number of retailers which they would go to use to get their top up, or in the extremist, you can do direct checks or vouchers to their home. These are the same things that we used when this was last done in about 2011 from memory, and it's something that we put a lot of thought into, and BEIS are currently in the process of working with energy suppliers to make sure that all those people do benefit from it. And with regard to your broader point on energy saving materials, you're right, lots of people can't afford solar panels. Although the VAT measure we've put in place will help, for a lot of people that obviously will not be suitable. But I think what we're doing for those people is actually spending lots of money to help upgrade their homes. There's two main ways that we do that. One is through the energy bill system, through something called the Energy Company Obligation. That funds through our bills, about £1 billion a year, which upgrades, I think from memory, about 300,000 homes a year. And again, and those are particularly people in fuel poverty, exactly the people you're talking about. So that's one thing we do through the bill system. The other thing we do with government spending, part of all the reason government spending is going up, is that we're spending about £3 billion over this Parliament to upgrade the energy efficiency of about 500,000 homes. Again, those will disproportionately be people in social housing or in fuel poverty. There's grants of up to £10,000 or £25,000 at no cost to the tenant, and they will deliver bill savings on average of about £290 to £300. So those are how we're helping those people to improve the energy efficiency of their homes.
Scotland is already much further ahead than England in terms of energy efficiency measures, so I don't need to hear particularly much about that. But I think you've confused two things, Chancellor. People on direct debit and people on prepayment meters, that's two different sets of people. Could you explain to me how somebody on a prepayment meter will repay this £200?
So, sorry, I got the numbers the wrong way around. It's 40% of people already have remotely accessible smart meters, right? And so the smoothing credit will be applied automatically to them. And then for the remainder, it's through the special action message or the other methods that we have to do it. And that, I mean, I think that again, we've been through that with BEIS and are comfortable that can be delivered. Because it will be applied automatically, because they have meters, even though they're prepayment meters, they're remotely accessible. So it can be applied that way to those 40%. And then for the other 60%, you have to go through one of these other methods I mentioned, which is either, as I said, special action messages, SMSs to their phones, credits at their stores which they go to top up, or in extremist checks in the post.
Some people on prepayment meters are on those prepayment meters because they weren't able to keep up with their bills, and they're paying back debt to energy companies at a higher rate than people who are on those direct debits. Will that money go to top up their bills, to allow them to pay for energy, or will that go onto their debt? And how will those two things be?
That is one of the things that BEIS are working through at the moment with citizens groups and the energy companies to see how best to allocate that cash. So I don't have a specific, I can get back to you, but I think that's one of the things that right now they're going through the implementation of.
When will that be done?
I don't know if you know, I don't have the exact, it's a BEIS-led process, Alison, so apologies, but I will get the dates back.
It was your announcement, it would be useful to know how it worked.
Yes, but obviously the operationalisation of that is being done by the Department for Business, but I'll happily write you.
The credit is supposed to be applied in October, and there's a statutory consultation period, which from memory, I want to say takes 8 to 12 weeks. Yeah. So I would say it will be in the summer that the exact delivery mechanism will be confirmed, but we can write to you to confirm details.
And will it go against debt, and will it be an additional credit?
That's one of the things that they are working through at the moment with people, and there's reasons that there's different ways that they might want to do it, but they're in conversations right now about
There's no opt-out to this £200 heat now, pay later scheme, is there?
No.
So people who are already in fuel debt, who are on prepayment meters because of that debt, are being asked to take on another £200 of debt from you, Chancellor?
No, actually, I think it's wrong to describe it that way, and I think it's also, I'd say, gently, it's wrong for to worry people that that's what's happening, because it's clearly not what's happening. Actually,
is it money you're giving them that they owe you?
It's not debt. It's not a loan. There's no interest on it. No one's credit rating is impacted. What it is, and particularly for the people that you're talking about, Alison, who are struggling, it's saying, hang on, we can't make all of this problem go away, and ultimately we are all collectively having to adjust to higher energy bills. But trying to do it all in one go is tougher. So instead of having to come up with £200 all in one go, let's spread that cost over 5 years so that your family finances can come up with £40 a year over 5 years rather than £200 all in one go. That's what it is, and I think that is the right thing to do to help exactly those people for whom it will make a difference. And given the choice of having to find £200 all in one go, if you're really, really struggling for things, faced with the choice of having to do that or saying just come up with £40 a year for 5 years, I think that will really help them. It was something that was actually requested by people like the Citizens Advice Bureau, from memory, particularly for that reason. And others said, can you spread the cost of the impact over time, because it gives family finances more time to adjust to it. So describing it as a loan is wrong. It is spreading the impact of a price increase over 5 years rather than having to deal with it all in one go at the beginning. And I think that is a good thing that will help people, and particularly those people on lower incomes.
If I give you money and then it's expected to be paid back, it's a loan.
The money
You're asking it to be paid back.
That's because of the mechanism.
At a time in the future.
The mechanism of how. So what we're doing is saying you don't have to come up with £200 this year, because that's a lot extra to deal with. Instead,
it's £40 next year, and the next year, and the next year, and the next year, and the next year.
Well, if you're talking about the people that who are really struggling to make ends meet, do you think they'll be better off having to come up with £200 in one go or £40 a year over 5 years?
I think you'd be better off with a grant, Chancellor.
Well, that's a different question, and that gets back to our point on what's an acceptable amount of borrow. Look, and that's a choice, right? I have a view.
Your choice, not theirs. They don't get to opt out of this.
And because I think it will help them.
You're forcing them to take something that you think will be good for them, and they might disagree, but they have to take it anyway.
No, I'm not.
That's not helpful, Chancellor.
No, not. What I'm doing is saying, actually, rather than come up with £200 in one go, particularly if you're someone who is struggling to make ends meet, you don't have to do that. Instead, do it over 5 years afterwards at £40 a year. That will be easier on those people's family finances. It will help them, and I'm confident that it will. Now, you might say, reasonably, that you think we should just borrow lots and lots more money to just wipe it all out. Now that's what you're saying. If you want it to be a grant, what you're saying is we should just borrow lots more and wipe it all out. And then that's a choice. I have a view that what we're borrowing already is, as we've described, 60% higher as a percentage of GDP than the post-war average, 20% higher than what we were forecast to borrow in October, for all the risks that we started this session with about rising inflation, rising interest rates, and actually not a huge amount of wiggle room really against a target of trying to get debt falling. Actually, I don't think it would be responsible to borrow much more. We have to balance these things. I don't think it's right to, and these people will not be helped if actually inflation gets out of control and we make the situation worse. So my view is borrowing should be responsible, debt should be falling, and within that we're trying to provide all the support that we can. And that's what this package does, and in a way that helps people with the cost of about half of it.
So these are people who are already struggling to keep the power on in their house. They are already rationing what little power that they use. These are people that are not able to boil the kettle because they don't have the money to pay these bills.
I think between...
Chancellor, for people in prepayment meters who are paying back that debt, for every £10 they top up, they have to pay £5 back already to their energy providers, and you're giving them an extra £40 a year debt over 5 years. That's not fair, is it?
I think when you say you want people to opt out, I think
they
what you're saying...
They should have a choice.
Well, the
they
choice
should have
would
a choice, and you're not giving them a choice here.
Because we can't do a universal thing for 30 million people and provide individuals with the ability to opt out and track it. There isn't an operational way to deliver that at all. Given the widespread impact that we've all been talking about and the cost of living, it seemed better to err on the side of being generous and making this available for everyone. I don't see how opting out is going to help the people that I think you and I both care about, because if they opted out of this, they would have to come up with £200 this year, whereas actually they're going to have to come up with none of that this year and just come up with £40 a year for 5 years afterwards. I don't see how asking them to come up with £200 this year will help them.
You can't explain how it's going to work to them yet either, if it's going to be applied onto their existing debt. You can't tell them that just now either. So this is of no reassurance, and it won't come into effect till October.
Because
either.
there's a statutory consultation that has to happen, and that's the legislation that we have, Alison, and those engagement sessions are happening as we speak, and they will know. And as I said, we're down to the 10% of people for whom this impacts in this way, because of the people on prepayment meters, as I said, 40% of them will have it automatically dealt with, and the other 60% we're working through the detail of how this will get to them.
National Energy Actions say, based on evidence of previous schemes, that 10% of vouchers won't actually be used. Are those people that are eligible for vouchers but don't actually use them, are they still liable to repay that £200 in full?
Again, you're asking about the operational implementation of this, which, as I said, the Department for Business rightly are currently about to consult on and then go through the implementation of it. In general, it's not something that we can have people opt out of when you're trying to deliver it at this scale, at this pace. Trying to create a brand new system that would track every individual person would be prohibitively expensive and take an enormous amount of time. So the choice was to provide universal support, err on the side of generosity, which I think, given the widespread impact of the energy price increase, is the right approach to take.
I'm not sure if you're aware, but standing charges on electricity meters vary quite widely across the UK. In London, they are going up by 38% to 31 pence per day. In the south of Scotland, they're going up to 47 pence per day, which is a 100% increase from what it was before. Why doesn't this Heat Now Pay Later scheme even attempt to meet the needs of different parts of the UK?
I said it's providing universal support to everybody. The £150 through a council tax rebate in England with Barnett consequentials for Scotland that will help 4 out of 5 households in April in one go, which I think is significant and will make a difference to people, and the remaining £200 universally as a discount to the energy bill in that month, and it takes that time to get to that point. But these things will help, as I said, tens of millions of people. They're being delivered very broadly across the country.
Okay. Weather isn't equal right across the country, though, is it?
No, but we do have the cold weather payments scheme. So for those who receive that means tested support, means it's an extra £25 a week when the postcode in their area shows that the temperature has dropped below a certain level. So that is a weather dependent part of the system that already exists to provide extra support to those in need at particular cold times.
Yes, but that doesn't deal with the standing charge disparities either.
No, but it's the bit of the system that provides extra welfare support to those in need when their postcode, the area that they're in, shows a drop in temperatures.
Why is there no additional support or energy price cap for people who use heating oil and LPG?
They do benefit from the council tax rebate. It's done through the council tax system, so they will benefit from that. And the electricity discount is done on the discount is done on electricity meters rather than gas meters specifically for that purpose. So they will benefit from both of those things.
They're having to fill up significantly more expensively than people who are on mains gas, because they're having to fill up a whole tank of LPG or of heating oil, and they don't have any choice about that, and that's gone up by hundreds of pounds.
Yes, they do. The price cap doesn't apply to that form of
So
energy.
why is there no support for that group of people? That's a significant number of people.
They get the support that is provided for through everyone else, and as I said, we've gone through the very specific extra discretionary support that we have that is given to local councils, particularly for those types of reasons where they'll be able to identify people who are in particular need. It can get discretionary support to them.
I was just going to add that the fuel duty cut applies to all types of fuel, so a proportionate cut is applied to red diesel used for heating.
Okay, but no additional support to those folk who are stuck off gas grid?
They disproportionately benefit from the energy upgrade schemes that I talked about as well. So they're targeted. There's multiple different schemes that do that, but I forget the name of the one that is particularly targeted to people who are off gas grid.
Moving on to the council tax reduction scheme, why did you decide to do that through the council tax system rather than through universal credit, for example?
Because I wanted to make sure that we helped those people on middle incomes as well, given the scale of the challenge that they face. This is not just people on welfare who are going to be impacted by the increase in energy bills. People on working families on median incomes will also be impacted by it, given the scale of the increase. And the council tax system is the best way that we could find to get cash to that broader population and do so in a way that was relatively fast as well. So the council tax system means we can help, as I said, 4 out of 5 English households and help them in April. The universal credit system obviously is about 5 million households. It's considerably less.
People who are on considerably lower incomes, would that not have been more hit, and on universal credit? Would it not have been more helpful to those people who really are struggling to get it to them more directly?
Through
being on a lower council tax band doesn't necessarily mean that you need that assistance.
What are you suggesting instead?
Perhaps doing it through universal credit or the legacy benefit system.
Just to generally up-rate benefits?
To use that equivalent £150 and get it out in a slightly different way. Because there's no.
I'm sorry. Are you saying we should take the same amount of money and give it only to people on universal credit?
I'm saying it seems a very blunt way of getting money out to people through the council tax system rather than on the basis of need.
So if look, it's again a choice.
I'm just wondering why that particular avenue
because
was
I
taken.
think there are lots of people who are not on universal credit who still deserve and need help to meet higher energy bills. And you might not, and that's fair enough, and therefore you could be comfortable just helping people on welfare. I think given the scale of the increase in the energy price cap, it was absolutely right that we help those people on middle incomes as well. That's why we did it through the council tax system. Now, I totally appreciate you might think, you know what, someone median household income of £30,000 doesn't need any help, and therefore you may not want to, then you could do everything through universal credit. I think that person on the medium household income does need help, and actually there's a very good correlation between household income levels and council tax bands. Not perfect, but it's the best one we have, and given, as I said, the scale of the problem, it was right that we help the vast majority of people. That's what helping through the council tax system does. I don't think it's right to just limit the help to people on welfare, but I appreciate that. That might be a choice you would have made.
Can I ask the government's guidance to local authorities on how to pass the rebate on to households in England who don't pay by direct debit says councils can choose whether to offer a £150 credit to an eligible household's council tax account as a payment option. Why isn't that the kind of default option right across the policy?
Sorry, again, the actual implementation of this is a matter for the Ministry of Housing, local government, and so what exactly? So they're responsible for the guidance, and they've worked with councils and the LGA about how best to get this support to people. So it's not a function of the money, which we've all approved. So I wouldn't probably be able to answer the specific point that you've got, but I'm happy to get back to you on it.
No, I'm happy to leave it at that then.
Fine.
Yeah, could I?
Yeah, Emma, please.
Thank you. It's just a quick question on standing charges, because I've had lots of constituents contact me about this, people who are switching the heating off to try and reduce their bills but seeing standing charges going up. Just a really quick one, because it's not my turn at the moment, but just to ask whether or not the Treasury were in any conversations with Ofgem about this, in particular looking at which companies are pushing the standing charges up more than others, and whether there could be any regulation regarding that increase in standing charges, because it's hitting.
Yeah, Emma, thanks for raising that. Again, it would probably primarily be something that the Department for Business and Energy would be engaged in. They were the ones that normally would talk to Ofgem, but I'm very happy to go and follow up on that.
The standing charges should be within the price cap.
Yeah, they're included within the price cap.
Yeah, like the balance of the standing versus the...
Yeah, but I can pick that up with Quasi and the Department for Business.
Thank you, Chair.
And I think, Alison, you finished? Yeah, so we'll go to Siobhan, please.
Thank you, Chair. Before I ask my questions about our proposed income tax changes, I just wanted to let the Chancellor know that the cost in filling up my Kia Picanto has gone up from £30 to £54 in the time I've owned it. Mr Sunak, did you face a similar fuel hike in the time you've owned your Rio?
How long have you owned your car?
About 3 years.
Oh, mine I think is probably older than that.
Is it a Picanto? Is it a Rio?
No,
Picanto?
Actually, we have a Golf.
Okay.
So,
but you fill up other people's cars now.
Yes, actually, I was an employee at Sainsbury's.
Yeah.
I was big of it, and very grateful to Sainsbury's for passing on the fuel duty cut very quickly, as did a couple of other retailers straight away, which is great because as you made the point, people's petrol bills are rising, and they're rising because energy prices globally are going up, partly in response to
Mr.
what's
Sunak.
happening. Well, if I could finish answering that question, since you started.
I
what's
get to
happening
answer
with
the
Ukraine?
questions, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Mr. Sunak, are you a fiscal illusionist?
Well, why don't you define what you mean?
Well, we have a tax burden rising to the highest level since the 1940s, the worst fall in living standards since the 1950s, public sector net debt reaching the highest level since the 60s, and real earnings growth facing the largest one-year drop since the 1970s. But you gave absolutely nothing for most people, particularly the most vulnerable, in your spring statement.
I fear, unfortunately, and apologies that this may become repetitive, but your list of things didn't mention the fact that we also had experienced a once-in-a-century pandemic, biggest economic shock in 350 years, and borrowing that spiraled up to levels that we hadn't seen since World War II. So, to repeat the previous conversation, the reason that the tax burden is rising is a direct result of the fact that the government is continuing to invest very strongly in public services across this Parliament at historically very high levels, at the same time as recovering from the shock of the pandemic and choosing not to go down the route of austerity. So most people understand that the government needs to pay for the things that it is spending money on, and so tax burden and spending are largely, if one's high, the other one's going to be high, and that's where we are with that. And in terms of the direction of travel going forward, as I've said, with that work out of the way and those decisions having been taken, the priority from the autumn onwards is to use whatever marginal pounds, the marginal space we have to cut taxes from this point. Notwithstanding the fact we have had to take corrective action to solve these problems that were not on your list, but the direction of travel going forward is to cut taxes. Now, all those other stats about inflation and living standards, yes, we, along with most other developed economies, are experiencing high inflation as a result of global forces. Now, that is happening in Europe, it's happening in the US, it's a result before the recent couple of months as a recovery from coronavirus, which was very clear and apparent in goods prices particularly, and then has been accentuated by the crisis in Ukraine, which is causing an upward spike in energy prices. So those are the things that are driving not just a fall in standards here, but also elsewhere.
No other country in the G7 or the wider G20s increasing people's personal income tax at a time when prices are rising. In your statement, you pledged to cut income tax tomorrow, what's raising national insurance today, widening the gap between the taxation of earned and unearned income, and the net result, according to the IFS and the Resolution Foundation, is that everyone earning below £34,000 a year will be worse off. Why did you prioritise your ambition to have a reputation as a tax cutter over helping people really worried about heating their homes or feeding their kids?
So actually, again, 70% of taxpayers will be better off as a result of raising the national insurance personal tax threshold, and we are choosing to help them by doing that. As I said, it's the best way to target.
That's misleading, isn't it? Because it's the net result that matters, and your so-called tax cuts only marginally reverse the historic hikes that you are already imposing.
We're talking very specifically about this next year in answer to your question about helping people deal with some of the rising cost of living. 70% of taxpayers will be better off as a result of the net impact of both the levy and the increase in the personal tax threshold. It is beneficial disproportionately for those on low and middle incomes.
If we do the maths, when you add up all the proposed tax increases,
I think, Siobhan, you're talking about over the Parliament, but yes, we've already had that conversation.
With respect, you don't decide what questions we ask or how often we ask them.
But I'm not saying that that's not the case.
Let's do the maths, though. When you add up all the proposed tax increases and subtract your fuel duty, income tax and national insurance threshold pledges, the net result is a 3.3% rise in the tax to GDP ratio between 2019-20 and 26-27. Is that really a cause for celebration?
No, it's a reflection of the fact that public spending is also, over that period, going to rise by over 2 percentage points of GDP, from around 39% to around 41% from memory on the total managed expenditure definition. And as we've discussed, government has to pay for the things it's spending money on. So as public spending rises as a share of the economy, unsurprisingly, related to that, the tax burden is rising to pay for that public spending. That's what's happening, and the reason that's happening is because we have stuck with ambitious investments in public services at a time when the economy is suffering from the effects of coronavirus, and therefore, rather than cut public spending, we're raising the taxes to pay for it.
Finally, I just wanted to ask about the proposed timing of the income tax cut in 2024. I wondered why this particular date was decided, and if you believe it's good economic management for a Chancellor to determine his fiscal policy decisions around the general election cycle, or do you think it just makes people more cynical about politicians?
No, what I think it does do is provide a direction of travel, which, given you've just asked about the tax burden being very high, which I agree with, and I'm very keen to see people's taxes come down over time from this point, I wanted to make sure people realise that was a serious commitment. We started in October with the cut in the universal credit taper rate. We continued that work last week with a very significant tax cut, personal tax cut, by raising the national insurance threshold, £6 billion. 30 million people will get £330 tax cut as a result of that. And to show people that we are very serious about continuing to do that and prioritising it, we've put it in the numbers to deliver at a time when we are forecast to be meeting our fiscal rules, where inflation is expected to have abated, and it's right that we have, I think, discipline in the system so that we are focused on delivering reducing the tax burden rather than prioritising more public spending. So I think actually it's an expression of that, and it's not at all uncommon for chancellors, both on the business tax and on the personal tax side, to announce things a year or more in advance of them coming into effect. That's happened previously on income tax, and it's happened particularly on business tax as well.
Do you think people are stupid?
I think people will see that.
You think people aren't going to see through this?
No, I think what people will see last week is that we cut fuel duty, which will help save them money when they're filling up their cars, that we created a tax cut for 30 million people worth £330 a year, which will really help, and that we continue to be committed to carrying on cutting their taxes over time, and that's the priority of the government.
In the general election year. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And Anthony, please.
Thank you, Chair. The cut in VAT on the cut in fuel duty rather on fuel. Various people criticised it, saying it would compromise the government's net zero target of reaching 2050. Do you think it will?
No. We have a very strong record on reducing carbon emissions. I think we've done, compared to the G70, about 40% reductions in carbon emissions since the 1990 baseline, compared to the other G7 countries have done about 5%. So our track record is very strong, and the Prime Minister set out a comprehensive and ambitious 10-point plan to help us get there over time, with investments, backed up by tens of billions of pounds of investment across the board in all the different things that we need to do. And particularly on the vehicle side, one might point to the investment we've put in, the numbers of which, about £1 billion on installing electric charging infrastructure across the country, charging grants for people, but also money for the new gigafactory, one of which has been announced.
And could I just point to the ABR actually have something in their economic and fiscal outlook about the increased take-up of electric vehicles, reducing the fuel duty forecast. So revenues are still quite substantially lower than they were forecast to be pre-pandemic. Only part of that is due to
government
freezes.
overall. Yeah.
Yeah.
But doesn't cutting, the government has got a policy of the fuel duty escalator of increasing the price by RPI every year. It hasn't done it for the last 11 years. But it does that because increasing the duty is supposed to encourage less car use. Presumably cutting the duty will encourage more car use.
I mean, again, it's offsetting what is a significant rise in the cost of the fuel in the first place, and I think, I can't remember, I think those two things broadly offset each other anyway in the short term, because the increase in fuel costs is obviously quite significant. Yeah.
And I think it's the case for many people, driving is inelastic, so people have to drive because they have to drive to get to their place of work, or drop their kids off at school or whatever it is, and marginal changes in the price don't make significant differences to how much they drive. They obviously affect the overall cost of driving, though.
Yeah. How you mentioned earlier that Sainsbury's passed on the cut quickly, but have you followed how quickly retailers in general have passed on the cut in duty to drivers?
Yeah, so the Department for Business are actively looking at all of that, and as you would have seen, the Business Secretary and I jointly wrote to all the various associations concerned at the time of the announcement. Pleased to see a handful of them straight away, so they were going to be passing it on, and we're keeping an eye on the pace of which that is happening. But and I know the Business Secretary is keenly following this and making sure that everyone does pass it on as quickly as possible.
The RAC said that it would have been a lot more progressive cutting VAT rather than cutting duty because it's charged at the petrol pump. Why do you decide to cut duty rather than, which is done at the wholesale level, obviously, rather than VAT?
I think like fuel duty is something that we do and we have done in the past, and as I said it's I think administratively easier because it's done actually at distribution point rather than at retail.
The other thing is cutting VAT on fuel duty wouldn't benefit businesses because businesses are able to reclaim
it back,
the input VAT.
And that's about 40% of the overall impact is business rather than individual on fuel duty. Yeah.
Why? And just come back to this, the fuel duty escalator, which has been government policy for a long time, but it hasn't actually, in the last 11 budgets, hasn't been followed through. It just seems a bit of a fiscal fiction to keep saying you're going to do it and cost it every year and then not actually do it.
It remains the legislative default, and that's why it's scored in that particular way.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Coming back to the other environmental measure you had was cutting to zero VAT on energy efficiency, things such as solar panels and heat pumps and insulation. That's incredibly welcome. That's something I've wanted to see for a long time. That's not going to have much of an impact on people's energy bills in the short term, though, is it? Or in cost of living in the short term? And presumably, I don't know if you've done a distribution analysis on that, but it's obviously only going to be people who can afford solar panels and heat pumps that are going to benefit in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's something we can now do as a result of having left the EU, because the ECJ had prohibited us from doing it in the full generous way that it was originally envisaged. So that's a welcome change. It will mean about in total £1,000 saving on a typical solar panel installation, which you're right, they're not cheap in the first place, but they do save you about £300 on average on your bills every year thereafter. So there's a reasonable payback period to them. But I think in answer to Alison's question, the same point is to help those who can't afford to do that. We have these two systems, one through the bill system, the energy company obligation that is about £1 billion a year. To do exactly that for those people in fuel poverty, and government is spending about £3 billion over the Parliament to help about 500,000 homes, again social housing, those off gas grid, fuel poverty in particular, help them do energy efficiency through grants, which will again save them about £300 a year on average. So that's how the policy is helping those people.
It does also apply to things like roof insulation or draft proofing, which obviously are much cheaper. Yeah. So
and even some,
if you were £300 for insulating a roof, the total VAT saving from paying zero is £57. So it's
even radiator controls from memory.
Smart radiator controls.
So yes, there are things that are much more accessible as well as it's not just the solar panel installation.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony. Kevin.
Good Chair. I just want to ask about growth and growth forecasts. Some people will say, I think you said earlier, Chancellor, that you would, if we're going to spend more, if there's more public spending, we need to pay for it. Some people might say, well, let's just add that to borrowing for now, get the economy growing more quickly because of lower rates of taxation, not put taxes up, and reduce the debt to GDP ratio that way. Why aren't we doing that?
Well, I think we are doing that, but we have to be, realistic about balancing taxes, spending, and what growth is likely to be in the short term. And one of the things that we set out in the tax plan is a range of options to improve how the tax system will incentivise more investment in innovation, in capital and in training, which I believe are the three areas that we need to focus on if we are going to drive up our growth rate sustainably, and we need to get the private sector to do more of that, not the government. So we can use a tax system to do that, and there are a range of options in the tax plan which will help do that.
Sure. And Gareth's going to come to that in his questions, but it's more about borrowing, really. We can borrow very cheaply. Can't we just keep racking it up and then just get the economy, get this debt under control by a faster growth of the economy?
You know what? I think when I first started this job and then the pandemic hit, there were a lot of people who told me that's exactly what I could do. And interest rates at that point, you'll remember, they were very low, inflation was very low, and everyone said, oh, it's going to stay like this forever, just borrow what you want, it's cost-free, no problem, don't have to worry about any of these things anymore, we're in a new era. I didn't think that was the case, right? And actually I got some criticism for saying at the time that I didn't think that was the case. But that is exactly what we are facing now. We are facing a situation with rising inflation and rising interest rates, and that has implications for the public finances and borrowing. You would have heard me mention that the total bill we'll have for our interest payments next year is forecast to be over £80 billion, £83 billion. That is 4 times the amount that we spent last year. 1% move in inflation and interest rates is worth about 20 billion quid of hit to us. I don't think it's right to assume that you can continue to borrow and that is cost-free or risk-free. We've talked about our headrooms already, and my view is we need to be responsible with borrowing, responsible with debt, not least because that means that we can help in the future when shocks come along, but also in the short term, we don't want to make this inflation problem worse. And actually more government borrowing in the short term has the potential for making the inflation situation much worse. And that would potentially force the Bank of England to put up interest rates. That would have an impact on everyone, for example, who had a mortgage. 1% increase in a typical mortgage outstanding over time is worth about £700 a year. Right? So we have to be very mindful of all these things. So just borrowing more is not cost or risk free.
Sure. Okay. You said a number of times at the dispatch box and other places that we're growing faster than any other G7 economy, bouncing back. I think at one point we were forecasting 6% growth in 2022, but that OBR is now saying 3.8%. Why is that? Why has that fallen back? Are we still the fastest growing economy in the G7 at that level?
We don't know because the IMF haven't published their new forecast.
Okay.
And it will be, it may well be different when they do that because inflation will hit different countries in different ways. The US, for example, is not a big importer of energy, so they will be much less impacted by a global inflationary shock than we are, being a net importer of energy. So almost certainly that will change the picture when those next global comparisons are done. But in terms of the reasons for the downgrade, and Dan may want to chip in, they are a function predominantly of the pre-existing impact of higher inflation, goods prices on the economic outlook, and then a partial taking into account of the impact of Ukraine. And I think it's, as the OBR would acknowledge, and they probably said this to you, they haven't taken into account the full impact. So there is the potential for the economic outlook and public finances to deteriorate by the time we get to the autumn, given that is the case. So, fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The ABR, I think about 0.5 percentage point of their the reduction in their growth forecast is a direct result of how they've taken account of the impact of the invasion of Ukraine on energy markets and energy prices. But as the Chancellor says, more broadly, it's a kind of terms of trade shock because about 60% of the inflation that we're seeing is a result of energy prices, 30% is a result of goods. We are a net importer of both of those, and it's inevitable, therefore, that we are poorer as a result. And it will the impact of that terms of trade shock will be quite widespread globally, but it will depend on the precise proportions of the things which have been particularly affected by the higher inflation, which sort of had begun post-COVID as demand, particularly for goods, rose very rapidly, and now we've had the energy price impact on top of that.
Okay, thank you. And how much worse could it get if things continue to go worse?
Well, probably, I think there's a range of sensitivities, if we put it that way. Let's do that. I think if you took the Bank of England's view, for example, on the economic outlook over the next few years, rather than the OBR's, that would imply a fiscal hit, purely a fiscal hit, which would wipe out over half of the headroom that we talked about in 2024. A sustained 1% increase in inflation interest rates, again, is about £20 billion. So that gives you a sense of how sensitive we are to some of those changes. And beyond that, the biggest driver is going to be probably what happens to energy prices in October. As we saw over the past month, we've seen very wild swings in what may or may not happen. At the top end of some of those numbers obviously are hugely, hugely significant for the UK. And that's why, as I said last week, the actions we've taken to sanction Russia and continue to do so are not cost-free for us here at home. And that's what the potential is.
We'll come to sanctions in a second.
Yeah.
Just in terms of trade, we're seeing trade intensity and exports dropping quite significantly compared to other nations, EU nations, for example. I think trade intensity is down by about 15% and exports down by 12%. Why is that? Is that Brexit? What is that?
Dan might come in a sec. It's quite hard to disentangle the various impacts of the pandemic, but also the change in our trading relationship with the EU. The data is actually it's a bit imperfect, and we're trying to pass through it at the moment. It's clear that you're describing a situation that has materialised. Now, I think it was always inevitable that if you change the exact nature of your trading relationship with the EU, that was going to have an impact on trade flows. But it's hard at this moment, until we get through all of this, to disaggregate the various impacts that are going on, would be my sense. But
yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think the latest ONS monthly data actually has goods exports to the EU above the level that they were before the TCA was signed. And EU exports have performed better than non-EU exports, so it's quite difficult to get a firm picture of what's driving it, and there's also quite a lot of volatility. So I'm sure it's something that the ABR will come back to in their next forecast. Sure.
Okay. Mayor's lecture. I know you talked a lot about business investment, but I say Gareth's going to deal with that. But you talked about you were concerned about a steady drift away from free market principles and what government shouldn't do, and should it be so interventionist. But nevertheless, we are pretty interventionist, which I support in terms of levelling up. How is that consistent, really, with not being interventionist and levelling up?
But even on levelling up, I think, as the white paper said, and the Prime Minister also said in his speech, actually we need the private sector to do the investment that's required to help level up and spread opportunity around the country. Private sector investment dwarfs public sector investment, and it's right that we create the conditions for that to happen, and then it's right that we also do the things that government is responsible for in a way that benefits all parts of our economy. For example, infrastructure investment being an obvious example of that, or rural broadband, just a couple of examples. But again, all of that I think is necessary but not sufficient. And unless private enterprise does their bit or follows and allocates capital in a different way, then it will be, we won't be able to realise those ambitions. But I'm confident that we're doing all the things that will make sure that we do.
I have a couple of more questions, and at the end of Gareth's section, if the chair will allow me. But just on to sanctions, obviously there's a kind of responsibility mainly in here in the Foreign Office in terms of sanctions itself. But clearly some of those sanctions really do affect the UK. You say that these sanctions aren't without a cost. So what role has the Treasury had in determining which sanctions to implement, particularly around financial services?
As you would expect, there's as all of these things are, we're cabinet government and we go through all these things together, and our job is ultimately on the economic side is to provide the advice and the analysis about the effectiveness and impacts and consequences of particular different sanctions, and then where we're responsible for working with industry to deliver them, that's what we would do. And in my role, I talk a lot to other finance ministers to make sure that we are broadly coordinated, or as coordinated as we can be, on doing similar things so that they have maximum effect.
They'll have different effect by different nations. You work with other finance ministers, absolutely. Of course. So what do you do in terms of cost benefit? Is that something you analyse before you recommend a sanction to?
Yes, as you would expect. I mean, it's not as easy as to reduce it down to one number, but clearly a country which has very limited economic interaction with Russia and is self-sufficient in energy itself is clearly going to bear the impact of sanctions very differently to a country that has a much more integrated trading relationship with Russia and is dependent on Russian energy, for example. Those are two extremes. And every country therefore approaches this slightly differently, whilst recognising, I think everyone and all my colleagues recognise where we can act together, it has more impact and is more effective.
We recently had an exchange of letters with John Glenn, Economic Secretary of the Treasury, about why you sanction which banks. That's not clear. Alpha Bank you sanctioned last week. It's not, the criteria for doing that isn't clear. Is there any way of clarifying who you're sanctioning for what reason and who you're not sanctioning for what reason? Because Canada, for example, seems to have sanctioned everybody across the board pretty much.
I think it would go back to your first question about the differential impacts on each country and making sure the case is made. I think on banks we now, like I said, are ahead of almost everybody. Now, Canada, a good example of a country that I think they themselves would admit has a pretty limited economic relationship with Russia, either through its banks or through energy. Now, so in one sense, it's pretty easier for a country like that to do that. Yeah, relative to all our European peers, and indeed actually the US, on bank sanctions we have gone further. I'm pretty confident that what we've done is significant, and ditto on the central bank side as well.
And principally the ones we haven't sanctioned as severely, that's to do with energy payments, presumably. Is that the one that
it's just about, exactly, and at this point there's only one, but we have prohibited that bank from accessing sterling clearing. So again, even on that, so you're talking about Sberbank, even on that bank, there's things that we have done that are more than, say, Europe has done with euro clearing.
Yeah.
And where we are is very similar to where the US is.
Okay. Obviously energy is the key one everybody's talking about at the moment, and different countries have different dependencies, of course. I see that Russia has now said that it wants its payments for its gas in rubles. What are the implications for that?
I mean, I think, look, Russia is going to try and do what it can to support its economy, and I think what we should take some comfort from is we are making life difficult for them, and that's particularly because of the targeted measures we've put on the central bank and their ability to access foreign reserves, and the other measures have meant that the ruble has plummeted by over a third. And that's quite significant, and the central bank has had to double domestic interest rates to 20%. So they are clearly feeling the pain for us, and they're going to try and find ways in which they can support their economy. Our job is to make sure we're continuing to apply the pressure. And I would, and just even though, rest assured that we are having a continual conversation amongst finance ministries and treasury departments to make sure that our sanctions regime is effective.
So if they went ahead with that threat and Germany refused to pay for that gas in rubles, they'd cut the gas off. What are the implications of that?
Well, again, I wouldn't want to get into hypotheticals, but clearly the biggest, we've been talking a lot about cost of living, and the biggest driver of that being energy prices, and a shortage of Russian energy obviously has very significant implications for European energy markets and energy pricing, which we are impacted by as well, even though we're not as direct an importer of the Russian gas, very small, but indirectly we're connected to a market which is. And at one point during the last month, the projected energy price cap in autumn went up to something like £3,400. That gives you a sense of what potentially some people at that point were worried about.
Sure. Okay. In terms of enforcement of sanctions, and we talk about enforcement a lot in various different contexts these days, quite rightly, the OFSI, the Office for Sanction Implementation, since 2016 has imposed 6 fines to the tune of 21 million quid. In the same period, the US version of that, OFAC, 92 fines, £1.5 billion. I know you talked earlier to Angela about the beefing up of the numbers of people in FSI. Doesn't seem to be as effective so far. Should it be? I mean, it's great that to hear you're resourcing it better, but would we expect an increase in the amount of fines and based on sanctions that we'll see in coming years?
So yes, you're right. The maximum fine they've so far done since they've only had the power since 2017, right? So that's the first thing. and I think the biggest fine they've imposed since then has been just over £20 million. And in the recent, Dan, you might want to correct me, but in the recent bill that passed Parliament, they were given new powers to enforce their sanctions and gather information they needed. So I think those new powers combined, which I think John Glenn has written to you about or spoke to you about, those new powers combined with the extra resourcing, makes me confident that going forward they can fulfil the role that we all want them to play.
Okay. What about Russia's ability to circumvent sanctions, either through various different nations that are willing to cooperate with them or different companies? How do we need to look at secondary sanctions? Is that something that potentially will be brought forward? Where are we with all that kind of stuff?
I mean, the first thing we're doing is trying to talk to all our partners across the world and urge them to join with us in imposing a significant economic cost on Russia, and that work is ongoing. And as I said, lots of countries have joined us in that effort, and everyone's playing their part in different ways. Well, not everyone, but lots of people are playing their part in different ways, which is good. And as I said previously, without going into details, all our finance ministries are working together to make sure that the sanctions we've got in place are effective. And to the extent we see things that might be risks to their effectiveness, you would expect us to respond, as we can. For example, recently there was a concern about the use of crypto assets to circumvent sanctions, and clear guidance was given by us, the FCA, and others, similarly in other countries, to make sure that the people involved in that were aware of their sanctions obligations.
How appropriate do you think it is that HSBC maintain a banking presence in Russia?
So all financial services entities that we are regulated for are complying with UK sanctions, and what they're doing, I think, in general, so I can't speak to every individual company, so forgive me, I'm not sure exactly what operational presence they have, but in compliance with the sanctions, all UK...
There's a bank there, it's not called HSBC, there's about 200 people work there, but they refuse at this point in time to divest themselves of that investment.
Yeah, and then on divestments, I think we've made the general point that where divestments obviously for different, it's not actually possible for many of these countries to divest assets because Russia has actually prohibited many of them from doing so. You've seen some announcements from other companies that have. Others have said that they're not going to do anything incremental. Each company is going to make its decision. Certainly, new investment is something that we said would be quite hard to justify at this point, and I think most companies I've spoken to agree with that. And then for those that are in a position to divest, that's something that up to them to do.
You support that kind of divestment? That's something we'd like to see from...
Yeah, I think each company is going to make its own decisions. I think it's right. They will have fiduciary responsibilities of their own, for example, to their own employees, their investors, which may well be UK pension funds, and it may well be that they're not actually able to divest, and if Russia is prohibiting them from doing so. So they're going to make their individual decisions. As a general sense, we will support them where they want to do so, if they think that's the right thing to do, and in general would find it hard to see how incremental investment from this point in Russia would be justified.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Chancellor, can I come back to one of your answers there on Brexit and trade? And I think you were basically saying that it's difficult to disentangle the various effects that are going on from the pandemic and Brexit, etc. And I guess that's true to a degree. However, and Dan might be able to find this chart for us, which is, I think, on page 64, chart I, which shows that how trade intensity of GDP for ourselves and our European trading partners and the euro area, etc., and advanced economies has changed during the period from when the pandemic Brexit struck and what's happened in more recent times. And what it shows is that we've gone down, there's been, as the OBR predicted, a slump in the level of our trade with the EU, and yet the other countries have now come back up quite strongly, but we've stayed down. Doesn't that tell you that the main distinction between ourselves and them is that we went through Brexit and they didn't?
It might well be. I'm just saying it's too early to be definitive about it.
What else might it be?
I mean, I haven't got all the numbers in front of me, but when I was looking at this a couple of weeks ago, there's quite. If you look at UK, EU, and UK rest of world imports and exports. There are a range of different things moving on, and they're not actually all consistent with themselves. So I think we're still trying to work through what all the impacts are. As I said, it was always inevitable that there would be a change in our trade intensity,
quite a significant
with
one,
Europe as a result of a change in the trading relationship. I mean that was expected and unsurprising when you change a trading relationship with the EU. And in general, I think trade intensity is falling.
Are you
globally.
concerned that we're becoming more of a closed economy now post-Brexit?
Not as a result of Brexit, I don't think that's the case. And in fact, actually, the work that the Trade Secretary is doing is making us much more open to countries
So
around
why
the
have we
world
got
for
the
trade.
significant reduction in trade intensity that stayed low, whereas others have come back?
Yeah, as I said, without a doubt, we're changing our trading relationship with the EU, and that means a different set of controls and things that people will have to do, and that will obviously have an impact, and that I'm sure is a big part of the reason why this is happening. I think it may be just a bit early to be definitive about which bits are doing what. In general, though, the approach is to be very much more open to the world on trade, and
that's the aspiration, but the reality appears not to be.
Yes, because the
that
benefit
direction.
of new trading relationships takes time. They don't happen all overnight. So I think that's, of course, that will happen over a period of time, and you'd expect to see that. And the conversations we're having about the CTPPP, for example, is a good example of the type of ambitions that we have on trade and being open to the world, and control of our own tariff schedule, right, which we have improved since leaving the EU to make it cheaper to import things, which, as you know, is good. It means that we're more open to the rest of the world as well. So that, I think that's very much, it's not about being closed. I think in general, you know, the world is having a conversation about post-coronavirus, talking about onshoring of supply chains and things like that.
Just and very quickly, so I'm anxious to bring Harry to know. I mean, if it remains the case that these new deals don't float our boat up very quickly, and we stay down roughly where we are, and we are a more closed economy, what concerns would you have around that, particularly around our mission to try and improve productivity, for example, and living standards?
So I think the OBR already factor in a decrease in trade intensity into all their forecasts anyway. So everything you're seeing is on the basis of an assumption that they have about exactly that phenomenon. So in general, I'm someone who believes in trade, because I think that there are benefits from investment, and it does have positive benefits on productivity. We've seen that, which is why I'm glad that we are forging new trading relationships with more countries around the world. And once we've left a customs union and single market, inevitably there is going to be a different trading relationship with that entity, which will have an impact on trade there. I mean, that's just an inevitability.
Okay, I did say final, but I will have a final if I may. So if the trade intensity stays down where it is, lagging all these other countries, and it is a consequence largely of Brexit, is that a situation where you're sitting here now compared to back at the time of when we were discussing these things? Has that surprised or shocked you?
You know,
is that
again,
what you
have to forgive me because I don't have the
expected?
numbers to hand or in my head as to what it is currently, what I expect it to return to, what was forecast at the time, what's in the numbers already. So I'm happy to come back to it at a future date, but I don't have all that information to hand.
Thank you. Harriet.
Thank you, Joe. Chancellor, you've mentioned in your evidence this afternoon the backdrop that you have experienced, so the pandemic, now war in Europe, the turning point in terms of inflation and interest rates. And I wondered if you considered yourself to be an unlucky Chancellor.
Well, I think that's.
I think we've all got to say yes to that.
Well, it's kind of you to say that, Harriet. But look, it is what it is, right? In one sense, you do the job. You have to just deal with whatever's in front of you, and we've had to deal with some very difficult and unprecedented things early on. That obviously has implications for our fiscal position, for tax spending and borrowing now. And I think it's just reasonable, it's part of the conversation to recognise that. And now we're obviously dealing with a brand new situation. There's a war in Europe and energy prices being where they are. That is just the reality of the situation. I think what it does do, though, is, if I'm going to reflect on it, it says that in the space of a very short period of time, we are experiencing shocks which in theory ought not to happen very often. the scale of the shocks we're experiencing are all once in a century, once in many decades, once in a half century. Yet they seem to be happening one after another, and this is only, by the way, 10 years after the last time this happened with the financial crisis. So what does that tell you? It tells you importance to have, for me, control over borrowing, responsible approach to borrowing and debt, so that you've got a strong foundation to carry the country through when these things arise, because they seem to be happening with a kind of alarming regularity, and I want to make sure that whoever's sitting in this chair the next time one of these things comes along will be able to do what I've done, which is either announce a furlough scheme or £9 billion of support for people on energy bills. That comes because the fiscal foundation we have is solid to start with, so that's why it's important.
We heard from the OBR earlier today about, and you've mentioned it as well, Chancellor, the interest costs and how they've doubled this year. So if you think of them as a department line in and of themselves, they've gone up 100% this year. You mentioned that they're going up even more sharply next year because of the impact on inflation on index-linked gilts. And indeed, if you looked at interest costs as a line item in the budget, it would be the fourth biggest department in terms of overall spending. And I wanted to sort of put that as a point at the beginning, because obviously if you look at the departmental spending envelopes that you've set out, they are going to be very exposed to inflation as well. So different departments are going to experience inflation differently. The OBR wasn't able to tell us which departments are most exposed to the current inflationary pressures, but I'm sure you are able to, Chancellor. So could you tell us which departments are going to see the biggest pressures in terms of energy costs?
Yeah. Oh gosh, energy costs.
Inflationary pressures.
I think it is difficult, and I haven't done the analysis in quite that way. I think what the OBR probably have said to you and probably said in there is that government experiences inflation differently to individuals, right? Because they're not exposed in the same way to market prices. A lot of things are fixed funds. For example, you announce £1 billion of a fund on something. If there's inflation, it's still £1 billion fund, but it might just buy a bit less of what it was going to buy before. So it's a slightly different way to think about it. Normally, we think about it in terms of GDP deflators is probably the easiest way that you think about the real versus nominal impact on department budgets. And that would suggest, we got to this conversation before about spending and borrowing. It is definitely right that higher inflation has an impact on the real purchasing power of cash settlements. That has always been the case, and the flip is also true. When inflation comes in lower, the purchasing power of department settlements goes up. Now, because our spending settlements were very generous in the autumn, even after the impact of higher inflation, you're still looking at a 3.7% real terms growth rate of departmental spending over the Parliament. So I think it's still generous. Does it mean people will have to work a bit harder to find efficiencies and make sure we get good savings for the taxpayer? They will. That's why we've set up a new committee. And it's right that we do that, because I think our collective burden is to reduce taxes on people, not do more public spending. In terms of the quantum, it's about, they put an estimate, I think, for GDP deflators at about £5 to £7 billion a year. So it's, that kind of scale over the period.
To take, for example, your spending priority, which is the NHS and the people's priority, electricity, energy costs, it's going to have a massive impact, isn't it, in terms of hospital budgets and NHS budgets?
I don't have an exact percentage of their budget. Obviously, look, most government departments, the biggest single cost is people, right, is more than these other things. So I don't have the split by department of the energy intensity of each department for you. But you're right. But it's why the NHS, doing brilliant work under the Health Secretary's leadership to find more efficiencies, and they have doubled their efficiency target from 1.1 to just over 2% over this period. And that's going to free up almost £5 billion to help them grapple with things like that, and that they will reinvest all back into the service. It's right that they do so, because we've all been having this conversation about tax burden. I think we need now for departments to find the savings to invest in public services, not come to the taxpayer for more.
You mentioned salaries being the biggest cost. I think it's going to be very painful for schools and for hospitals to find these energy budget increases out of what you're saying is going to be a fixed envelope. But in terms of salaries, what have you priced in? What is the assumption that you've put in for this year's pay settlements?
So the way that process works is there isn't a central pay assumption. We did that in the pandemic, but at this point, each department individually is working through their process with their independent pay review body. They submit evidence on a department by department basis as to what is appropriate and affordable for them and what they think they need to do. That process is playing out as it normally would, and it's right that it does so. And with regard to each department, they'll all be slightly different and have done that in a slightly different way. So there isn't a uniform assumption or a settlement across the board.
And for pensioners this year, you're guaranteeing the triple lock again.
Yes.
And what's budgeted in terms of the increase there?
It will be whatever the estimated CPI is in September, which I don't have to the top of my head.
7.4%, I think.
7-ish%.
7.4%. So you're guaranteeing that if that's the highest of the three, that's what will be passed through to pensioners this September.
And if earnings are, it's the triple lock would function as it is intended, as it normally functions.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harriet. Thank you. Emma, please.
Oh, thank you. I was expecting it to be Gower, but I'm delighted that it's me, Chair. Just a quick question to start with, Chancellor, which is, I've just had a message from a local pensioner who's collecting for Ukraine, and he's spotted I'm asking you questions. So he said, can I ask you, Chancellor, why can you sort out him being able to gift aid his donations because he doesn't earn enough to pay tax? So I said I would ask you that myself. In terms of gift aiding to the Ukrainian situation for people who don't pay tax, you were looking at match funding it up to a certain amount. Have you any plans to look at doing a similar system?
And I'll have to get back to you on it because let me go and look. I think we have an existing small donation.
We do, we have a small donation
that
scheme
works on the charity basis
for sort of cash donations,
which I think
collection buckets. We have it's a kind of grant scheme, but I don't know quite how it would apply in this case. So I think we'll have to get that.
I'll get back to you.
Thank you. He'll be very grateful, and he's doing a fantastic job collecting for them. Chancellor, I don't wish to have the same answer given on this, but I just want to draw your attention to somebody who I was speaking to last month, who was somebody who was working for years. I'm very proud to be working, but whose wife has a frontal lobe dementia and progressive supranuclear palsy, which is a degenerative condition, and she will only deteriorate further. And he carried on working up until the point when working became impossible, and he has had to now become her full-time carer. And he was in touch with me because he was struggling with coming to terms with the universal credit system, which for anybody who enters it is extremely difficult to understand all the various complexities. Now, in the evidence that you've given so far, you have said you made a political decision to help people who were working. Now, he can't work, and he's not going to be able to work until his wife passes away. Surely there is reason for you to go back to the department and look again at the support, particularly for people who, for various reasons and through no fault of their own, are completely unable to work.
So first of all, I'm very sorry to hear about his circumstances, so pass on that to him for me, please, Emma. And I don't think it's right, so there's no support for people who are not in work. And again, rather than get into a kind of casework situation, just to take a step a little bit back, that the energy package of £9 billion that we announced will help everyone with their energy bills, and it will disproportionately help those on lower incomes.
I'm just asking,
and on top of which, again, I don't know, again, that individual situation, but for those people who are struggling with housing benefit, for example, the uplift that we've put in place will mean an extra £600
You must accept, and I believe that you're intelligent enough to realise that you must accept with the cost of living increasing, the cost of living is increasing more than his income is increasing. That's a fact, in regardless of which little pockets of money he's able to get here and there. What I'm asking for is, you don't have to give me a policy commitment now. What I'm asking for is that you're able to go away back to the department, look particularly about how this is impacting those people who are caring, those people who are caring for disabled people, and look at what more can be done to support that particular group of people.
So, as I said at the beginning, as we said in the document, as I said on the day, the single biggest driver of the cost of living impacts that people are fearing is energy prices. And we've announced a considerable amount of support for the price cap increase in April. None of us know what the price cap is going to be later in the year, so it would be appropriate, as we've said, to wait and see before deciding on the appropriate. Well, he's about to get, again, we're getting to the specifics, but he will probably get help starting very shortly with energy bills where the price cap goes up, and then, as I said, when we know what the situation is in autumn, that would be the right time to look at the situation then to decide what's appropriate at that point. With regard to people on disabilities in general, we spend about £58 billion a year across a range of different benefits. Now, everyone will have their view about whether they spend more, less, differently. If you look at the OECD's analysis of how different companies or countries spend money on disability benefits, we rank pretty well. We're ahead of countries like the US, Canada, Austria, Germany.
What he's telling me.
Australia. And that's going on a range of different things, which I'm more than happy if you want to write to me about his situation to figure out what are the many things we're doing for people who are disabled or caring for someone who is.
He's on a fixed income. His wife is only going to get worse. He cannot work. There are thousands and thousands of people like him around the country. His income is decreasing at a time when, and he's having less money to live on, and he's having to be reliant on coming to his MP and being signposted to various charities and support. What I'm asking is for you to go away and have a look again at the support, particularly for this group of people. I don't need to hear the answers you gave previously. What I'd like to do is hear you say to me, we need to actually, look at the support that we're giving to this particular group of people. What I will do is, again, write to you, and people like him and people in those circumstances are exactly the kind of people who should benefit from the household support fund. It is there to help vulnerable families like his who may not feel that they're getting the support they need elsewhere, but it's there to help them through that, and the guidance of that will be published very shortly, and the Department for Work and Pensions are working on it. I'll make sure when that's done that I let you know so you can pass on to him and he knows where to go.
Another bureaucracy.
Okay. Moving on to the situation with P&O, which I'm sure you'll be as outraged as I am at the appalling way DP World has treated their 800 staff. I wonder, has the Treasury considered revisiting the freeport status of Thames and Southport freeports, which are both operated by DP World?
So we are across government reviewing the relationship with DP World and all the various contracts and things that we have. There isn't a contractual route to change the terms of the various things we're doing under the Freeport programme, and it's not as simple because a Freeport benefits lots of different people in a local area in lots of different ways, and although one company might operate an area, it will be all the other companies that use the space and employ people or are going to employ new people or invest in the place that will create jobs and help people locally that actually the ultimate beneficiaries of the benefits that the programme does. So we're looking at everything. I can't say much more than that, but I just say, look, it's not as straightforward because there are lots of other companies and therefore local communities and residences that are the ones that are benefiting from it. And I'm very happy to have a conversation with those local areas about that particular topic.
Just to clarify for myself, so one of the things you're looking at would be another company running those freeports. Is that correct?
I don't think that that's possible. I can't stop a company that owns a site from owning the site. We're worried about property rights in that regard, but.
Okay, and it's also been reported P&O received millions of pounds in furlough support. I think the Mirror said it was £10 million that they received during the pandemic. Do you have any plans to ask DP World to pay any of that back?
So we don't have any. We don't have a legal ability to do that. But as you've seen, the Transport Secretary is leading the work across the board in engaging with the company and making it clear about our expectations of them and reviewing all our relationships with them.
Okay, and will the government be reconsidering whether key infrastructure should be operated by companies who don't employ workers under UK employment law?
Again, I think the Transport Secretary's made an announcement on this, and the government said the plans that it's bringing forward to legislate, if required, in terms of changing some of eliminating the loophole that there may exist in employment law about the national living wage. So that work is already underway and has been announced.
And when you're looking at awarding the companies for the free ports that are up and coming, are you going to be looking at DP World and maybe having a different opinion to them that you had in the past, bearing in mind how they just treated their workers?
Well, so these
for the future free ports.
There are no planned extra free ports in England. At least there's a process underway in Scotland, but the free ports in England have all been announced. So there's just the remaining free ports in Scotland to be concluded in conjunction with the Scottish Government.
All right, thank you. Moving on to looking at student loans. The changes made to the student loan system save you £34 billion over the forecast period, and the impact analysis published by the Department for Education shows that 8 in 10 income deciles of graduates will be adversely affected by these two changes. The two income deciles who actually make savings from the changes are, of course, the two highest income groups. So why has the government chosen to impose higher lifetime repayments on the lowest earning 80% of graduates, but chosen to lower the lifetime repayments from the two highest income groups?
So I think the Education Secretary addressed this when we outlined earlier the reforms, but I do think they're a sensible set of reforms. So currently the system we have is one in which 3/4 of all borrowers fail to repay their student loans. So, and 44p, almost half of every pound that is borrowed from the taxpayer is written off. So that's the current system, and without any change, the student debt was estimated to reach, I think, over £500 billion. So it was a system that was unsustainable and unfair, because ultimately many of the people that we've been talking about on lower incomes are subsidising a system that, where people are not paying the money back. And then there are changes that are being brought to expand the generosity and scope of the student finance loan system, which will mean that anyone will be able to access 4 years' worth of this funding to do not just university degrees, but more modular courses at level 4 or 5 at any stage in their career.
I am aware
but
of those
I think if you don't mind, please, Emma, I could just explain what we're doing with the changes. So what that means is you can go and get one of these courses at any stage in your career, and as part of broadening the scope and generosity, and then making the system fairer for all of our constituents, especially those who didn't go to university, but also make it sustainable and able to do that. There were some changes made, but they will mean that no one repays any more than they borrowed in real terms, which is a good thing. And alongside that, it's right that the principle that people who benefit from the finance, which is generous, are the ones that are paying for it back. Okay. It means a typical person who starts a new degree and earns about 28 grand when they graduate will pay about £17 a month back. So there's still a threshold under which they
Chancellor,
don't repay.
A graduate with a lifetime average salary of £88,000, someone who will earn 3.5 million over their lifetime, will pay 26% less in student loan repayments as a result of the changes that you've introduced. A graduate with a lifetime average salary of £18,000 will pay 174% more as a result of the changes. And how do you justify a policy which appears so regressive? And just before you answer, it's worth pointing out that the average salary in Hull is £26,000. The average salary in London is £40,000. So we're talking about graduates who choose to remain in the areas where they're from, areas like Hull, being penalised for being graduates in that area because of the changes which you're introducing. How is that fair?
I don't know if I followed your examples, Emma, but someone with I think you said
someone
earnings
with
of
an average salary, £88,000.
No, the second one.
£18,000 will pay 174% more as a result of these changes. It's from table here is just showing it and the proportion of graduates earning.
So if you send it to me, I'll have a look at it afterwards. Someone earning £18,000 won't pay anything back because the threshold is that you start repaying.
Average lifetime average salary of £18,000, 174% more, because it shows it here. And by average lifetime salary, obviously we're taking into account that people who might earn less than the £25,000 salary might go part-time for a while, have maternity leave, as I did, and I'm sure many other people did as well.
Without seeing an example, it's hard for me to comment, but in general, I'm someone with a lifetime average of £18,000 will generally
it was
not be.
88,000.
No, the second
No,
example was 18, because the repayment threshold is only 25, so you have to earn 25 in order to start paying anything
my
back.
point was it's a lifetime average, so if you have maternity leave off, if you have time off during your lifetime average can be lower than the £25,000. And I myself an example of that. When I was a full-time teacher, I then went part-time, then had maternity. You can have a lower lifetime
I think,
average
look, as a
than
general thing about
25,000.
fairness, I think it's completely reasonable that people benefit from taxpayer subsidised finance get a benefit from that in higher earnings, then pay back in a progressive way. That's what the system does. I don't think it would be fair to all the people we've been talking about earlier on in this session who are on much more modest incomes, struggling with the cost of living, and we're talking about their taxes and everything. I think for that person to be having to subsidise a loan that someone benefits from but then doesn't pay back, I don't think that's fair, because that burden ultimately falls on all these other people that we've all been talking about all through the session.
If you're a graduate living in Hull earning the average salary of £26,000, with the changes that you've introduced, they're going to be paying more back than a graduate on an average salary in London on £40,000, because on this table I've got in front of me here, it says average total lifetime repayments impact 113% if you're earning on 26,000, on graduates earning lifetime average of 43,400, it's minus 13%. How is that fair?
Again, I think, Emma, maybe the best thing is for you to send me that and I'll have a look at it and get back to you, because in general no one can pay back more in real terms than what they've borrowed. These are what the reforms that we've put in place do, particularly because they're more generous than what Augur recommended on the interest rate charged, mean that nobody pays back more in real terms than what they borrowed. So what you pay back is a function of how much you've borrowed.
Maybe it's my fault for not making myself clear.
As I said, if you send it to me, I'm happy to get back to you, because I can look through them in detail.
Okay, but as it stands at the moment, as we've already said, 60% of people before your changes didn't pay back all of their student loans. And now your system means that 70% of people will repay all of their student loans. So what the changes that you've introduced in terms of the interest rate, meaning that you'll never be higher than the amount you borrowed, are only going to be helping those people who would have already have paid off all of their student loans. The only people who've already paid off all of their student loans are the highest earners. There's lots of people who take out student loans who will still never repay them, but instead of having that written off after a number of years, they're going to be paying that for the rest of their working lives. This is what I'm saying about it being an additional tax on those people. And it's impacting graduates who are going to be earning less throughout their working lives.
I think it is a fair and progressive system. I think it's been broadly described as such. I think it's reasonable that people benefit from a taxpayer subsidised finance system, then pay back the benefit of that over their lifetime. That seems entirely reasonable to me, and is especially fair to those people who didn't benefit from one of those degrees and get the benefits in their earnings of that. I don't think it's right that other taxpayers have to pay for them not paying that money back. I don't think that's reasonable, progressive or fair. And you're right, the reforms mean that people over time will pay more back, because at the moment it's not fair to everyone that they don't.
And the lowest earners, I'm saying, are paying a greater proportion back.
Not the lowest earners, because there's still a threshold which is at £25,000. So people earning below £25,000 don't pay anything back. So those are not the lowest. The median salary in this country is about £24,000. So low earners won't pay anything back because they won't earn above the repayment threshold. And actually, for people from disadvantaged backgrounds, one of the other things that was announced by the Education Secretary at the same time as this is an increase in the amount of scholarships for people from disadvantaged backgrounds to attend university as well, to make sure we continue to broaden access to some of these things. And actually, the change in this finance system, it's going to be much more generous. And allow many more people to access what is very generous taxpayer subsidised financing for them to get the skills they need at any stage in their career in a way that suits them. I think that's a really good thing.
When you're looking at the impact on their incomes, what you've introduced here with the changes that you've made is effectively a tax on lower earning graduates. And you said in your spring statement you were announcing the biggest net cut to personal taxes in over a quarter of a century. When you made that calculation, were you including the changes to student loans?
No, because this is not personal taxation. This is very specifically to the individual person, the repayment of their student loan. We collect it through pays because operationally an operational way to do it, but this doesn't apply to everybody. This is for someone specific who benefits from a generous taxpayer subsidised loan when they go to university. Reasonable to expect them to pay that back over their lifetime earnings, which will be higher as a result of them having gone to that university and got that degree. I think that's reasonable and fair to all the other people who didn't benefit from that.
This is a significant revenue raising measure, that you've introduced here, and you've sort of done this through a written statement being snuck out by the university minister, which is going to have a huge impact on the take-home pay of graduates.
So it was just Education Department talked about it and announced it as you would expect them to, and held accountable for that in Parliament. In terms of it being a revenue raiser, as I think the OBR were pretty clear about, probably with you, but certainly in the documents as well, we do the accounts on an accrual basis. So what that means is you recognise upfront the improvement in the loan terms, which will not benefit until the 40-year duration of that loan. So it looks optically like there is money being raised from it because you're recognising upfront, but that there is no cash benefit of that. That cash benefit happens over 40 years. So that's not money that's available to spend today at all. So I think it's wrong to describe it as a kind of immediate source of funding that you could use for something. You certainly can't. And you see that on the impact on debt, which is accounted for differently. And there isn't a big improvement. And for that reason specifically, I think the OBR said that, but they also disclosed all their numbers, excluding the impact of this, so as not to give people the impression that this was money that could be spent today, because we can't spend it. It's purely accrual accounting of a 40-year improvement in loan terms.
Back to the point I was making before, in terms of levelling up, the government's own impact analysis of the student loans reforms shows that by a considerable distance, the majority of graduates who earn the highest salaries are located in London and the South East, and that these students will gain from the reforms at the expense of others. Is the student loan reform not an example of redistributing from all other regions in the country back to London, and therefore levelling down rather than levelling up?
No, it's actually implementing the recommendations of an independent review to broaden access to the generous student finance system to ensure that more people at more stages of their career could access the financing to do things that were not necessarily degrees. I actually think that is good, and it's broadening opportunity to lots of people.
Introduced many things. Olga also talked about introducing, but not that we're here to discuss the Olga review, Chair, but happy to take it up at a later date. Olga also talked about maintenance loans, maintenance grants, and greater support for students in that way. Olga made many recommendations that the government chose not to implement, so to pick and choose which ones we want to talk about now seems a little disingenuous. But it goes back to the point I was making. If you're a graduate in the north and your income is therefore less, through the reforms that are introduced here, you're going to be paying more back. If you're a graduate in the south and your income is higher, you've gained from this reform, and that doesn't seem to me very fair or very progressive. But perhaps I stop there, Chair.
Thank you. I think we'll probably just write to you, Chancellor, on that point, as you've suggested. I think those figures are from the DFE analysis, but we'll send it through to you.
And it may well be more appropriate that they answer it, but yes, if they're their numbers.
Great. Emma, thank you.
Okay.
Finally, to Gareth, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chancellor, I want to talk about business investment. You set out in the spring statement that this is a priority for you, that you're going to set out to engage with businesses to figure out what the best thing you can do to help spur business investment. We have had a global pandemic. We've had a war in mainland Europe and an inflationary shock driven by energy prices. This all hits business confidence, which hits business investment. So 2 questions, I guess. How much can you actually do, given these external factors, on business investment? And how can you restore business confidence in this kind of environment?
Perfect. Thank you, Gareth. And I'll try and be brief because I'm going to quite running on a bit. But so look, business investment has been a long-standing issue for the UK economy. OECD average is about 14% of GDP. Ours is more like 10 or 11, and that has been the case for a long time. If you look at our productivity difference with countries like France and Germany, a lower amount of capital investment accounts for about half of that difference. So it's a pretty significant explanatory factor for some of our productivity shortfalls vis-a-vis those countries. This is not a government investment problem. Government investment is now at high levels, sustained high levels. Private investment dwarfs government investment as well. So it's private investment where we have the issue. Now, what many businesses have made the point is that whilst we have low headline rates of corporation tax, we treat the capital investment much less generously through the tax system than other countries. And in the tax plan that we set out, we outlined a range of different options that we can use to address that and improve the generosity of our tax system with regard to business investment. And we'll work with businesses over the summer to figure out which of those is the right way to do that and announce those proposals in the autumn for implementation in spring next year at the time that the super deduction ends. I think that's been the single biggest request from business, has been to do that, because they recognise that that can be valuable and that we are behind most of our competitors in the generosity of our current system.
Although the OBR have come out in their recent statement basically saying that the pandemic has been less impactful on a firm's ability to invest than they expected a year ago. Why is that?
Yes, I think, because thankfully we've managed to do a good job of keeping the economy going through it, and that's meant that it was less impacted, combined with and you've seen firms actually build up enormous amounts of excess savings, over £100 billion, but it's probably gone up since then. I don't know what the new number is, but it will probably be higher than that. And the super deduction has also helped. Not as much as what one might have originally thought, because Omicron has come along and extra resurgence, but it does seem to have made a difference in firm intentions. And that's exactly the type of evidence and analysis that we'll want to do over the coming months to figure out what the right solution is on a more permanent basis. And we'll look at what's been happening, what we think will make the most difference going forward.
One of the things that keeps coming up in conversations that I have with small businesses and particularly entrepreneurs is that the UK actually has a pretty good environment for startup investment, but when it comes to scaling up, there isn't enough investment capital, and a lot of the firms go abroad, go to the United States and elsewhere. So what do you think we can do about that?
So I think there is a perception of that, and actually when you dig into the details, it's probably actually far better than people think in one sense, and we've closed a lot of the financing gaps that used to exist vis-a-vis the US. It's still definitely a case for these very late stage companies. So we're doing a couple of things, or probably three specific things I'll point to. One is reforming the listing rules for the stock exchanges here, which will improve the environment for companies like that to raise public equity capital. So Jonathan Hill, I commissioned to do a report on that. We're implementing all of the changes that he recommended on things like dual share classes, free float requirements, etc. And we're also looking at reforming the prospectus directive as well and changing how we do secondary markets. So all of that's happening on that side. The second thing I'd point to is the Future Fund breakthrough. Building on the experience of the Future Fund, we've created a new fund that will partner with the private sector to help fill that financing gap, specifically for deep stage tech companies, which are more R&D intensive, require large amounts of capital and stay private for longer. So that's a new innovation that's been very warmly welcomed by the community. And the third thing is reforming things like the pension fund charge cap, or indeed Solvency II, which will unlock more institutional capital for assets like this, which are more kind of private equity, venture capital, risk-oriented assets, and more illiquid. So I think the combination of those regulatory reforms can help do that as well. So those are probably the three things I'd point to.
Okay, thank you. I was struck, page 40 of the spring statement, the chart that you have in there shows very clearly that Israel and South Korea are really going gangbusters when it comes to R&D spending as a proportion of GDP. I think Israel was 4.5%, UK is a woeful 1.2%. One thing that we don't have in common with a lot of countries that are experiencing strong business investment is we actually have one of the most generous R&D tax credits in the world, but one of the lowest R&D investment levels. So is that something you're looking at?
Yeah.
Who do you consider best in class when it comes to international comparisons?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good observation. So I think innovation accounts for pretty much all of our productivity gap with the US. If you think about multi-factor productivity, and historically has been the largest source of our growth, accounting for about half, but it has tailed off since the crisis, so we need to reinvigorate it. Again, government is not the problem. We're increasing public R&D investment over the course of this Parliament significantly to kind of leading levels, well above the OECD average. But where we really fall behind is on business investment in R&D, as you pointed out, and that is where we are less than half the OECD average today, business self-financed R&D investment. And that is in spite of having in spite of spending the most out of any country, bar one, on R&D tax reliefs. So something in that system is not working because we're not getting value from the taxpayer pounds that we're spending. We're going to look at that, reform it, and again in the autumn come up with what the solution should be to take effect in the spring to help drive up that number.
Thanks, guys. If it's really quick, because we've kept the Chancellor quite a while and he does need to get, but if it's a real quick one, Kevin.
There are two measures now that are preventing investment that we already have. You invest in plant and machinery, your business rates go up. VAT thresholds at 85,000. You know, and I know, lots of businesses stay below that deliberately. France, it's 25k for services business. Germany, it's 20k. Shouldn't we look at these?
Right. So on VAT thresholds, I normally get asked the other way around from all the people who want it to go up. But I do get some the other side of the 85k who think it's unfair. You are right. Look, we have the highest VAT threshold in the G20 pretty much. But it's frozen for the next few years, so in flat terms, so that's how that will work. In terms of investment, though, for those small companies, what we do have are two things. One, to your point, we're introducing a growth relief to do exactly that. So if businesses invest in plant and machinery, particularly on the green side, we're having two reliefs to discount their business rates bill. One is an improvement relief and one's a green relief. We announced those in autumn. We'll consult on those and get people's views. They will be finalised in the autumn budget to come in spring, so we'll deal with that.
Green relief is actually
the green relief we brought forward. Sorry, that is already
so
happening.
If you put a solar panel on your building for microgeneration purposes, it will be disregarded. For
yes,
the one's only a year. Still is.
But the improvement relief we're working on, they have something similar in Scotland, and we'll figure out something, and that will come in by next spring. And then we do have, and I'll finish on this, the annual investment allowance, which is pretty much the most generous version of that we can find in the world. What that is for £1 million of expenditure, so it will cover all our small and medium-sized businesses, you get the benefit of essentially full expensing. So you can write off the full amount of the investment in that year. So it's a very generous tax incentive for small and medium-sized businesses to invest. Again, that is due to run out, at the higher level of £1 million run out spring, so that will be part of our deliberations for what we do in the autumn. Right.
Just briefly and finally, Chancellor, on the 9th of March, the Prime Minister said that he'd be announcing a new energy policy in days. It's now the 28th of March, and you're widely reported to be blocking it. Can you tell us when we can expect it?
I'm certainly not blocking anything, and the Prime Minister's continue to work through the details of that. Given how important it is, I think it's important that we get it right, and it will impact lots of different things, and it's been worked on at pace between all the relevant ministers.
Chancellor, thank you very much. I think we should let you go. We've had you here for about 2.5 hours, and we do appreciate it. Good luck, and thank you for appearing before
Very much.
Order. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.